Hello. At some point in the next week or two, I'm going to release that short early medieval film. I have actually finished it now. I just said that I'd upload it to Patreon first, so I'll do that, and that's the only thing stopping me from uploading it here. But in the meantime, I thought I'd make a more kind of chit-chatty video. So sorry that it's not very scripted. About identity, and identity is something that's very important, obviously, to all of us by definition, and also it's important when looking at history. And I think I just thought it'd be useful to share my philosophy on identity, because not necessarily because I want everybody to agree with me on it, but because it explains where I'm coming from in a lot of cases in my personal life, and also when approaching history. I have struggled in a minor way with my own kind of identity, in as much as sometimes I've been worried about people who I'm sort of close to imagining that I think something I don't really think, or imagining that I feel something that I don't really feel. And this was, I think, probably subconsciously, this was part of the reason that when I did that cross-cultural emotion video a few months ago, I mentioned, or I told a story about my own mum's death and my reaction to it, because I got the impression, and this isn't true looking at it now, but I got the impression that everyone on the internet treats death as something that's inherently very bad and sends you into complete emotional disarray. And there are some things that send me into emotional disarray, but other people dying isn't usually one of them. Maybe if they died in really horrible, abrupt circumstances, it might be different, but people dying of illnesses and things doesn't tend to upset me that much. So I thought, I almost felt like my identity was not being acknowledged by these things, and my feelings were not being acknowledged. And that's kind of, I suppose, arrogant in a way, but it seems a lot of people have similar views, similar feelings on that to me, so maybe it was worth saying. It's also, I suppose, looking at it from a sort of demographic angle, there's, quite rightly, I think there's an emphasis in media today, at least Western media, of encouraging men to express their emotions, because historically sometimes men have not expressed their emotions because they thought that it wasn't part of their identity as a man to be expressive in that way. And I think this has maybe gone too far in the other direction in some cases, and led to people assuming that men feel things when they actually, in some cases, are not feeling anything. They're not feeling upset about something. That it's not that they're repressing their emotions necessarily, it's just that different people feel different things in response to different stimuli. That music is truly curious. I've never heard that before. That's very distracting, but it's a free country, I suppose. But yeah, of course, identity, that's so distracting that I don't think I can be out here anymore. I might have to do this inside. I think fear of losing one's own identity, or having one's own identity diminished, is the cause of a lot of pain nowadays. So, as one example, that's been in the UK media recently, the disputes between trans people who want their gender identity to be recognised widely, and people who perhaps feel for some reason that it shouldn't be recognised in certain capacities. So, this is an issue of one person's identity clashing up against another person's identity. And just to make my biases clear here, I am generally on the trans side of this debate. I don't like talking about politics on this channel, but just because I've mentioned the issue, I think it's important to make clear what my own biases are. But but clearly, despite the fact that I may have a an opinion on this, there are people on both sides who feel that their identity is threatened. I think trans people are more likely to be threatened, have death threats, and actually be killed as a result of it. Obviously, the core of the issue is trans people's the sort of interaction between trans people's identities within themselves and within their minds, and the way the world outside treats them and kind of interacts with that identity. But on the other side, there are many people who feel that as women, their identities are under threat, and they consider a woman to be a certain thing, and they feel that admitting people who they didn't previously consider to be women into that demographic threatens their identity somehow. And although I think it's so contentious a debate that I feel quite nervous, frankly, putting anything about it on YouTube. It's, I think it's a very good modern example of a situation where two different groups of people feel that their identity is under threat in two different ways, which causes a lot of pain. Another example would be radicalization, how certain people's fear that they're going to lose their identity is played upon by people who want to drive them in a certain way ideologically. If you convince somebody that their identity is genuinely under threat, then you can convince them to do all sorts of things and say all sorts of things in defense of their identity. And whether that identity is under threat from the West, or whether that identity is under threat from immigrants to the country or whatever, you can, if you can really convince somebody that their identity is under threat, you can make them do a lot of things. So those are two modern examples, and I think there's a point where the modern examples interact with the historical examples that I'm about to give, in elderly people, or just older people in general, who are often kind of viewed as crotchety and, occasionally making embarrassing comments or holding views which are slightly outdated or considered slightly racist or homophobic nowadays. And I think this is another situation where a lot of pain is caused, and the issue here is that these people, these people's entire lives are not really taken into account when these judgments are made. I think the fact that this person may have had, been extremely kind throughout their life, they may have had fairly socially progressive views when they were in their 20s or 30s relative to the average view of the time, but when anybody gets into their 90s, they're likely to have fairly socially conservative views, because people's attitudes to social issues change very quickly, and as people get older, their views, their opinions, their tastes tend to become less flexible. They tend to become less neuroplastic, and so it's natural that people in their 90s hold views which are outdated. And I think dismissing them as somehow bad, or thinking of them as kind of old news because of that, I think I think it's a shame, and I think we would do well to consider that. Of course, this doesn't apply to people who are actively going out and harming people, but I think we do well to consider that when we're in our 90s, there will probably be social issues that are a hot topic that we ourselves feel strange about, or don't fully understand, or can't wrap our heads around, because we've come from this culture that we're in now, and culture will have moved on, culture will have changed. Yeah, I just think from both angles there could be a lot better communication if maybe each side showed more respect to the other. And then we move into actual historical examples, I think it matters less on a personal level because, of course, people who lived hundreds of years ago are dead. And so misinterpreting their identities and misinterpreting their feelings on things is not quite as dire, because you're not actually hurting them, as far as my idea of the afterlife goes, at least. But I think it is still possible to show disrespect to these people, and also to underestimate the wide range of human cultural diversity by assuming that these people had identities that were equivalent to our own. So one example of that I can think of is the idea of kind of cohesive identities like Celtic identity, which nowadays there might be merit in, people who are Welsh or people who are Irish. I'm not either of those things, so I can't speak for them, but they may feel affinity with each other, partly because both of those groups have been affected by colonial activity from the English in history. So that's one thing that might bring them together. But the idea that this cohesive Celtic identity stretches back to the Iron Age is, I don't think it's well justified by historical evidence. I think, the Iron Age, at least in Britain, was a time of great cultural diversity, and although it seems as though Celtic languages were widely spoken within the UK or within Britain at that point, and people probably would have recognised that the languages were very similar to each other. The idea of a cohesive Celtic identity, I think, is not historically justified. I think the same is true of any or many ideas of cultural identity that stem from a language family. I don't think that I really have any more culturally in common with a Swedish person than I do with a Finnish person. And Swedish people speak a Germanic language and Finnish people speak a Uralic language that's not demonstrably related to Indo-European languages at all. These ideas of modern identity stemming from some ancient cultural connection, I think, can misrepresent history in a way that's possibly disrespectful to historical people, and also just not helpful academically. To use an unrelated example, just so that I'm not accused of having a particular political bent on this issue, projecting gay identity back into cultures where it's not necessarily appropriate to do so. So, for example, people have had sex with members of the same sex, as far as we can tell, throughout history. In the Roman period, in Roman Europe, at least in certain cultural situations, seems to have been pretty common for men to have sexual relations with other men. But the idea of projecting modern LGBT identity back onto these situations doesn't seem justified by the text, because there doesn't seem to have been a Roman concept of homosexual. Further texts that were discovered might change our understanding of this, but it seems as though, in Roman Europe, broadly, men having sex with other men was, something that could be somebody's preference, but that didn't make the person belong to a certain social category. So it's not that people didn't have that preference in the past, it's just that the way society was structured did not have that as a discrete kind of category of person in the same way that it is nowadays. And I wouldn't want to talk about this too much without doing more research on it, but the idea of someone who is gay or queer in modern Western culture is very, very culturally conditioned, as anything is culturally conditioned, as the idea of a man is culturally conditioned, or the idea of a woman is culturally conditioned. Projecting that all the trappings of that identity back into the past is not justified, and is perhaps disrespectful to those people in the past who would have identified with some aspects of it but not others. One example from my own experience as someone who learns about history is that as a teenager I was always kind of, I suppose, I was interested in early medieval history, but I had, in the way that teenagers have reactions to things, I had this reaction to the fact that so many people interested in early medieval history were just interested in the military aspect, or had got into it from something like Lord of the Rings, or playing some kind of tabletop game, which is not, obviously that's not a bad way of getting into it, that's a completely valid cultural expression, and there's nothing wrong with being interested in it from that angle at all. But I think I had this reaction to that, which was, oh, I'm not interested in the military stuff. And I probably had, and I probably still have to some extent, that bias when I'm looking at early medieval history of having less interest in the military stuff than maybe someone at the time would themselves have had. It does seem like there are a lot of aspects of early medieval English culture that were fairly militaristic, or idealized combat in some way that I don't know that much about, because I had this reaction to it when I was a teenager. And that, again, that is, I think, maybe me being somewhat disrespectful to these people and not acknowledging all aspects of their culture just because I personally don't have that as part of my identity myself. I hope these examples have been numerous and diverse enough that I have not pissed anyone off too much. I will try and make a point of not getting political with these videos, because, as I've just said, I think applying modern politics to history is just a way of misinterpreting history. I suppose the takeaway would be that, at least if you want to consider my philosophy on these things, as far as modern interactions go, try to acknowledge other people's identities rather than denying them. And I think it's always good to express and experience your own identity fully, but in a way that, as far as that's possible, without squashing other people's identities in the process. That's my opinion anyway. And when looking at the past, try to bear in mind that modern ideology, modern politics, modern ways of thinking about things are very often not applicable. Sometimes they will be, but sometimes, well, always, I think it's worth stepping back from your own perspective, stepping back from any kind of modern, structure of thinking about these things and taxonomizing these things, and try to think about if there's some other framework that would make these old ways of thinking and these old ways of behaving make more sense. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope this video hasn't annoyed anyone too much, but I will see you soon.